The Chinese exclusion era of the late 19th and early 20th century is often remembered as a dark period of US history that was largely defined by open discrimination and persecution of Chinese immigrants. Many historians have framed labor unions as the leading force behind Chinese exclusion, and have pointed to the openly hostile rhetoric of labor leaders and anti-Chinese mob violence thought to be carried out by labor. However, much less emphasis has been placed on the role of capitalists during this period, who used their ownership and control over politics, media, the legal system, and means of production in general to shape collective attitudes around Chinese immigrants. The class struggle that took place between the emerging industrial bourgeois class and the exploited proletariat laid the foundation for immigration policies, social attitudes, as well as state and federal laws which would increasingly come to demonize and exclude Chinese migrants from the US. Racism and violence was inflicted upon Chinese newcomers, not solely through labor unions, but through a history and context of class struggle that needs to be closely examined in order to formulate an informed perspective on the violence and hostilities that erupted during this period. European American settlers who had initially arrived on the east coast of the US began migrating across the heartland towards the west coast in the mid-19th century. The Louisiana Purchase of 1804 opened up a large swath of territory in the middle of the country, and after the Mexican-American War ended in 1848, the Southwest was annexed, the Mexican inhabitants systematically removed, and European settlers moved in. Shortly after the establishment of small settler communities, gold flakes were discovered at Sutter's Mill in California. The discovery caught national attention, and as news of Californian gold spread towards the East Coast, European migrants from all over America began to make their way west to secure their chance in amassing a small fortune of gold. Many Chinese laborers also came from the opposite direction, arriving by vessel on the shores of the Pacific. The impact of the Opium Wars on China's economy caused many to look for employment abroad, even if it meant making the long trip to the US. It was common for Chinese families to pool their money together to send one male family member to make the trip to California during the gold rush. Many of these migrant laborers were not entirely motivated by the prospect of becoming rich through the discovery of gold, but were simply looking for a means of supporting their families back in China. The large number of Chinese migrants making their way to the West Coast can also be explained through the simple fact that California was a shorter time distance from China than it was from New York. It would take roughly 6 weeks for an East Coast settler to travel by land all the way to California, but for Chinese traveling by sea, the travel time was only about 1 week. In 1830, the census reported that only 3 Chinese residents resided in the whole country. But by 1848, the first Chinatown was established in San Francisco, which had grown from only several hundred residents to roughly 13,000 by 1854. In 1870, 46,000 Chinese lived in California, and by 1882, the year of the Exclusion Act, California was home to over 100,000 Chinese. Chinese migrants not only worked on the mines, but also worked as cooks, laundrymen, servants, agricultural workers, factory workers, and small businessmen. Among the first Chinese to make their way across the Pacific, sometime around 1830, were merchants and traders. They initially engaged in trade and diplomatic relations with the US, but when the gold rush struck, the demand for labor rapidly increased, and the largest Chinese merchants, who became known as the Six Companies, shifted towards facilitating large imports of Chinese labor to America. For Chinese willing but financially unable to migrate, the Six Companies would lend money and arrange for the individual to make the trip to America, where they would work to pay off their debt. The Six Companies would also charge modest fees that would fund a small number of essential services for the migrants, such as temporary lodging, basic health care, and assurance to send their remains back to China in the event of their death. The Six Companies were in an opportune position to make the shift from importing Chinese goods to importing Chinese labor, and in doing so, acted not only as an economic, but cultural bridge for the Chinese entering America. Initially, Chinese immigrants were welcomed and received with favor among the ethnically diverse American population. They played a visible role in public life and were prominently featured in parades and other cultural events as well. American miners in California were among the first to learn of the rich umami flavor of soy sauce and were impressed by the versatility of the various starch-based sauces used in Chinese cuisine. In fact, chop suey is widely known as the first Chinese-American dish, which was born in California during a miscommunication between a group of white miners and a cook at a Chinese restaurant. Legend has it that when a Chinese cook ran out of his traditional ingredients, he could only offer the miners what he called chop suey, which roughly translates to miscellaneous broken pieces. The miners enjoyed the dish so much, they started spreading the word about chop suey, and eventually it became the most well-known Chinese-American dish. It was during this period that the governor of California referred to Chinese migrants as one of the most worthy classes of our newly adopted citizens, and later added that further immigration and settlement of Chinese is desirable. The Alta California, a San Francisco newspaper, went so far as to suggest that the Chinese would one day become full American citizens, who would vote at the same polls, study at the same schools, and bow at the same altar as our countrymen. This generally benevolent attitude towards the Chinese lasted so long as the mines continued to yield gold. But in 1853, gold production reached its peak, and the recent discovery of a large gold deposit in Australia threatened to flood the market and reduce the price of US gold. The gold rush entered a sharp decline, and the end was in clear sight. California could no longer fulfill the promise of the golden tales that had been told of her. In the mines, Chinese workers received a wage of roughly $5 to $8 per day, while white miners, backed by their rights of citizenship, received $16 to $20 per day. Cheaper Chinese labor was just as skilled and efficient, and was therefore looked upon favorably by the mine operators seeking to reduce labor costs. When the mine operators started laying off large numbers of obsolete miners, they began with the more expensive white miners. While capitalism was still in its early stages in America, Californian mining had become large enough to give rise to a small class of mine owners and operators. These capitalist mine operators may or may not have personally known each other, but nevertheless came to recognize their common set of class interests that they collectively exercised through capital accumulation, the wage labor system, politics, the legal system, and social networks in the media. Unemployed workers in California struggled to find work that was no longer there. They saw that Chinese labor was still employed in the mines, and the capitalist press was framing these Chinese workers as stealing the jobs that rightfully belonged to white labor. The white working class consumed these messages and generally fell for the myth that they held closer interests with their white capitalist exploiters than they did with their Chinese co-workers. It wasn't long before the white workers boldly asserted that the jobs in the coal mines belonged to them, and took up the cry of California for the Americans. White labor's animosity towards Chinese labor reached a peak on February 5, 1859, when local miners in Shasta County organized for the purpose of expelling Chinese workers from the mines. During this meeting, the white miners decided that they would give the Chinese until May 5th to vacate the mines. Otherwise, they threatened to assemble and expel such Chinese, peaceably if we can, forcibly if we must. Between the 25th and 28th of February, well before May 5th, the white miners followed through with their promise of forcibly expelling the Chinese as they descended on the miner camps at the mouth of Rock Creek. 50 Chinese workers were removed from the mine and then marched through the town by a mob of angry white miners. A few days later, a group of white men, well armed and equipped, descended on Horston, Middleton, Oregon Gulch, and other small towns in the vicinity. They rounded up as many Chinese as they could, paraded them through Shasta County, and then sent them away on boats headed south down the Sacramento River. The class consciousness of the white miners was not yet developed to the point that they firmly recognized the capitalist class as the instigator of class struggle. Without a clear and developed understanding of the nature of their exploitation, the ethnic differences between the Chinese and whites could be used as a wedge by the bourgeoisie to divide the workers as a class. In doing so, the capitalist class could divert blame for the unemployment crisis off themselves and onto unskilled Chinese laborers. Many Chinese put up bitter resistance to their forced displacement, and during the expulsion process in Shasta County, a riot almost broke out among the large crowd. The county sheriff's office deployed 60 deputies to Shasta to disperse the tense gathering and restore calm, which, along with a well-timed and cool-headed speech by one of the more moderate miners, proved successful. Violence was averted in this instance, but through further political and legal pressures from the government and intimidation tactics by white miners, the message was received. By the winter of 1861, virtually every single Chinese person was expelled or had left Shasta County and the surrounding area. Although Chinese migrants continued to make their way to the West Coast, it is likely that the violence and exclusion of Chinese would have continued to increase if it were not for the exploding demand for labor on the western track of the Transcontinental Railroad. Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862 and once again in 1864, with the latter granting 60 million acres of public domain land to the newly formed Northern Pacific Railroad. Thousands of Chinese were once again recruited by capital to carry out the heavy labor necessary to construct the railway. In 1864, there were 1,000 whites and 3,000 Chinese working on the railroad, but by 1869, the same 1,000 whites still worked on the railroad, but the number of Chinese had skyrocketed to 9,000. The emerging US capitalist class relied heavily on the cheap and abundant Chinese labor that was necessary to carry out large infrastructure projects during the gold rush or on the railway. Over the peak years of the railway's construction, the Chinese contributed well over 2/3 of the labor on the entire line, hitting a population of roughly 10,000. The super-exploitation of the Chinese made these infrastructure projects economically feasible by substantially reducing overall labor costs. The National Pacific Railway paid skilled white workers $2.50 per day, unskilled white workers $1.50 a day, while the Chinese only made $1.25 per day, which was the same rate as white workers roughly 10 years earlier. A New York Times editorial discussed the need for Chinese labor, arguing that it was impossible to build railroads here without them, and the failure to secure as many as can be used makes it difficult to push work as fast as railroad managers wish. The Chinese were the backbone of the construction effort, suffering the most as they were killed in falls, explosions, and some even from scurvy due to a poor diet afforded to them on the front. Perhaps the most dangerous work was the blasting of rock faces from mountainsides. Many of the Chinese who died from explosions, rockfalls, and other hazards were buried in simple, unmarked graves along the grade in order to prevent slowing the construction effort and allow for easier relocation for shipment to China. Some of the cadavers were shipped to Missoula for burial, though the original cemetery now lies underneath a housing subdivision, with the remains of these workers sometimes discovered during gardening, landscaping, or new construction projects. The rights of Chinese labor were heavily restricted by the Naturalization Act of 1790, which granted free white persons of good moral character sole rights of citizenship. Chinese immigrants of all classes were denied American citizenship because they were not deemed white. The California courts reasoned that the Chinese should be barred from testifying against whites because Indians were not allowed to testify against whites, and since the Chinese were the same race as the Indians, having come from China many centuries ago, the law which applies to the Indians should also apply to the Chinese. This meant that, like the so-called Indians, the entire legal apparatus, from the courts to the sheriff, would turn a blind eye when it came to instances of violent attacks against the Chinese. By 1858, the California courts prohibited the immigration of Chinese altogether. It was the first state-based Chinese Exclusion Act that foreshadowed the federal legislation introduced 24 years later. During the early 60s, the so-called Chinese question was largely put on hold as the attention of authorities shifted towards the Civil War. Prior to the war, when slavery dominated the South, the notion of cheap immigrant or indentured labor was seen as similar to slave labor, but the aftermath of the war created new material conditions that dramatically reshaped the mode of production in American society. Once slavery had formally been abolished and Africans were free, the status of immigrant Chinese labor was also reconfigured. The main contradiction to be addressed in the status of Chinese labor lay in the fact that capitalists required cheap, abundant labor when mass mobilization was required, but during economic downturns, they would need to scapegoat unskilled Chinese labor as the cause of the crisis by framing them as pulling wages downward. The capitalist newspaper Harper's Weekly, which called itself the Journal of Civilization, peddled some of the most explicit images of how Americans would come to view Chinese in the post-Civil War era. Chinese immigrants were referred to as celestials, foreign, alien, different, and other. During earlier phases of Chinese immigration, for example, the celestial was associated with white attitudes of curiosity, intrigue, or simply indifference. But once Chinese labor was constructed by capitalist newspapers as posing a threat to white labor, the celestials' foreign language, customs, and mannerisms became seen not only as a threat to white labor, but a threat to the white American way of life in general. The Chinese were typically not Christian, spoke little English, dressed in customary Chinese robes, and wore their hair in a traditional Manchu queue, as mandated by the Qing dynasty. Bourgeois newspapers tapped into these differences and associated Chinese immigration with the idea of a yellow peril and loss of American culture and labor power. The capitalist newspaper Harper's Weekly, which called itself the Journal of Civilization, peddled some of the most explicit images of how Americans should view Chinese. For example, this illustration depicts a group of celestials who have gathered for a picnic and are playing music. Some white people appear to be looking on with interest as they walk by. In another illustration, the celestial is depicted as an intelligent, reasoning, but assertive character in dealing with the question of Chinese immigration with a naturalized citizen. But many of the images produced by Harper's Weekly also frame the Chinese as a foreign threat. Here, they depict the country as a Chinese dragon who, with a cunning grin, appears to be taking US-China diplomatic relations under its control. The cheapest unskilled Chinese labor came from workers who were derogatorily labeled coolies, a term that was perpetuated by white newspapers that were almost entirely ignorant of the Chinese language. The word coolie derived from the Chinese words ku, which means to rent, and li, which means muscle. Hence the coolies were unskilled laborers, or those who rented out their muscle. In the American context, the term became closely associated with slave, and after the Civil War, the new free republic would no longer tolerate coolie slavery, and the coolie became a figure who was no longer welcome. Unskilled Chinese labor was always the first to be attacked in the racist backlash of economic crises. It was the lowest paid strata of labor, and as such, was particularly blamed and framed in the capitalist press as the cause of falling wages. Newspapers like Harper's Weekly went to great pains to stoke anti-Chinese hatred towards the coolie in its illustrations. In this drawing, Lady Liberty stands over a shackled Chinese man sitting on the ground, while staring disapprovingly at a mob of angry Irishmen. Another San Francisco publication that was pushing much anti-Chinese imagery was the Wasp magazine. During the year of the Exclusion Act, the Wasp depicted San Francisco burning to the ground while Chinese look on, cheering and cutting fire hoses. In another rather obscene illustration from Harper's Weekly, two Chinese men brandishing swords titled "Cheap Labor" are sneaking up behind a white worker with the seeming intention to decapitate him. These illustrations were supplemented with stories of negative influence that the Chinese had on American culture and the threat they posed to white civilization. There was a particular fixation on drawing an association between Chinese women and prostitution, and it wasn't only the capitalist press that spread these types of discriminatory labels, but the medical system as well. The notion that all Chinese women were prostitutes was a view that was entertained by the American Medical Association, which conducted a study reporting that even boys 8 and 10 years old have been syphilized by these degraded wretches. These findings would later be translated into state laws that would form the foundation of federal laws such as the Chinese Exclusion Act. From 1862 onward, beginning with the federal law against Coolie immigration, the exclusion of Chinese continued to escalate not only in California, but at the national level as well. In 1870, Congress denied Chinese women from immigrating to the US with their marital partners. In 1875, the Page Act was introduced, citing the need to limit the immigration of coolies, prostitutes, and those with a medical history of leprosy. That same year, California introduced the first anti-drug legislation, which criminalized visiting or operating opium dens in Chinese neighborhoods. In 1879, Congress passed legislation preventing no more than 15 Chinese immigrants arriving per vessel, and in 1880, the Angel Treaty was signed between the US and China, which sought to limit Chinese immigration to the US. As anti-exclusion laws developed, so too did the power of the labor movement. White workers were strengthening their collective voice through organizing efforts that culminated in the establishment of the first US trade union in 1869, the Knights of Labor. Organized labor continued to grow until the financial panic of 1873, which saw owners and operators cut rail worker wages 3 times in 12 months, largely due to a sudden withdrawal of private investment from the railway. The wage cuts were an outright assault on the livelihood of all the rail workers, who responded by organizing and launching the first general strike in US history. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 began on July 13th when 40 disgruntled locomotive firemen walked off the job. By the end of the day, workers blockaded freight trains near Baltimore and West Virginia, allowing only passenger traffic to get through. The National Guard arrived in Baltimore, armed and with bayonets fixed, and when striking workers and those who had gathered to support them put up stubborn resistance to the militia, the troops fired on the crowd, killing 10 of them in cold blood, including a newsboy and a 16-year-old student. The shootings sparked a rampage. 14,000 rioters took to the streets and began destroying the city, burning buildings, crashing vehicles, and cutting fire hoses. As the strike spread to Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, and Missouri, it became the first US strike in history to be synchronized across several states. The strike paralyzed the country's commerce and led governors in several states to mobilize 60,000 militia members to reopen rail traffic. At the height of the destruction, Maryland's governor telegraphed President Rutherford Hayes and asked for troops to protect Baltimore. But when the militia members arrived, many of them sympathized with the rail workers and refused to carry out their orders. The governor of Maryland then called in the National Guard troops from Philadelphia, who quashed the uprising by firing their guns into a crowd, killing more than 20 civilians, including women and at least 3 children. A newspaper covering the massacre contained the headline, "Shot in cold blood by the roughs of Philadelphia, the Lexington of labor conflict at hand, the slaughter of innocents." An angry crowd in Pittsburgh forced troops to retreat to a railroad complex and then proceeded to set all types of equipment ablaze. Fires lit up in large parts of the city, destroying 39 buildings, 104 engines, 46 passenger cars, and over 1,200 freight cars. Roughly 40 people were killed in the violence, and the Pennsylvania Railroad claimed losses of more than $4 million. By the end of July, most strike activity was over, and in the end, over 100,000 people had participated, 1,000 had been jailed, and 100 people had been killed. The Annals of the Great Strikes in the United States, published in 1877, said that the scenes in the city of Baltimore were not unlike those which characterized the events in the city of Paris during the reign of the Commune in 1870. But the publication also incorrectly added that this was not an organic workers' strike, claiming it was evident that there were agencies at work outside the working men's strike. The people engaged in these riots were not railroad strikers. The internationalists had something to do with creating scenes of bloodshed. The angry workers tapped into this denial. and proceeded to unleash their pent-up frustrations against capital onto the Chinese. After the Great Strike had failed to yield any wage gains, the workers in San Francisco came to believe that the Chinese were the enemy. The San Francisco Riot of 1877, which was an anti-Chinese pogrom carried out by a white mob across San Francisco's Chinatown, erupted in the immediate aftermath of the strike. In the chaos, 4 Chinese were lynched and $100,000 worth of Chinese property was destroyed. The pogrom represented the success of the capitalist class in redirecting class struggle in the form of a strike into social chauvinism and anti-Chinese violence. The capitalist class also sought to prevent such a strike from occurring again by using the state to brutally repress Irish Catholic workers that they referred to as Molly Maguires. The Irish could be scapegoated because, like the Chinese, they too were considered a foreign element that could not be fully integrated as US citizens. But unlike the Chinese, the Irish were still European, and therefore qualified for some of the benefits associated with whiteness. By the 1880s and 90s, the Irish were full American citizens who could now look down upon immigrant labor. Dennis Kearney, for example, was an Irish descendant and leader of the Working Men's Party who was known for his long and fiery speeches that focused on 4 general topics: contempt for the press, contempt for capitalists, contempt for politicians, and contempt for Chinese immigrants. This labor leader was best known for closing all of his speeches to American laborers with his rhetorical signature, "Whatever happens, the Chinese must go." The similarity between the Chinese and Irish reveals the extent to which American society came to view whiteness, rather than nationality, as the essential component to becoming a full citizen. The Irish, like the Chinese, were scapegoated for economic crises and made into racist caricatures in the press. However, the Irish, unlike the Chinese, could appeal to their European origins as their key through the Golden Gate of achieving full citizenship. In return, however, the Irish were expected to enforce white hegemony over the working class and discipline Chinese labor the way they themselves had once been regulated by American labor. As the railway began to open, large quantities of people and resources made their way across the country, with goods reaching far inland as well as to the remote rail camps. The great influx of materials and people helped perpetuate the growth of industrial capitalism on the West Coast, which allowed California, through its naked exploitation of Chinese immigrant labor, to transform social and economic relations with unparalleled rapidity. In 1880, Karl Marx marveled at this swift pace of development, commenting that nowhere else has the upheaval most shamelessly caused by capitalist centralization taken place with such speed. On August 22, 1883, the Northern Pacific Railroad drove the last spike to complete the transcontinental main line. The completion of the railroad was a monumental industrial achievement, not only in terms of the colossal size of the project, but also in the sense that it would yield countless benefits in faster and easier shipping of goods and people. The completion of the railroad was a cornerstone of U.S. industry and was widely celebrated among the bourgeois class, who topped it off with the now infamous last spike ceremony. The Chinese, who constituted over 80% of the railroad workers who actually built the tracks, were not discussed in the press at all. In fact, for the Chinese workers, the completion of the railway was nothing to celebrate. Like the drying up of the gold mines before it, the completion of the railway led to a flood of Chinese unemployment, which was exacerbated by the influx of European Americans coming in from the East Coast, who still held closely to the idea of California for the Americans. The Chinese Exclusion Act was signed into law on May 6, 1882, 15 months before and perhaps in anticipation of the railway's completion. The act was initially implemented as a temporary measure for 10 years, but in reality it would last for many decades well into the 20th century. In wake of the Chinese Exclusion Act, many reasons were given for why the Chinese could never become U.S. citizens and why they should be prevented from immigrating. but William Lloyd Garrison systematically attacked every point raised in favor of Chinese exclusion. The proponents of exclusion claimed that the Chinese did not assimilate but huddled together. But Garrison points out that naturalization laws have excluded the Chinese. The decision not to assimilate was made by the federal government, not the Chinese. He attacked the notion that the Chinese were undermining the American economy by saving their money and sending it back to China. He pointed out that a frugal lifestyle was what allowed the early European settlers to survive, and that care for one's family is not only an American value, but a Christian one as well. Garrison's fundamental argument, however, was that this so-called yellow peril was being pushed by what he called the political class. He pointed out that the yellow peril was tiny, constituting approximately only 100,000 people in a country of 40 million. Not only was this mythology being pushed among white voters, but more importantly, it was being used as a means of confronting the Chinese Empire in a broader effort of constructing a US empire. The yellow peril myth was therefore being used to invoke irrational fear of Chinese and hatred towards China. On the domestic front, this meant taking on forceful measures to liquidate Chinese from the workplaces and towns now inhabited by Americans. Everything from subtle discrimination to open hostilities and assault were used to scare Chinese migrants away from their homes. The most well-known attack during this period was the Rock Springs Massacre. On September 2, 1885, a dispute broke out between a group of white miners and a group of Chinese miners in a local coal mine. The white miners were attempting to remove the Chinese miners from one of the more desirable pits that they were seeking to occupy. When the Chinese miners refused to move, they were badly beaten, with one later dying of his injuries. After this confrontation, the white miners, many of whom belonged to the Knights of Labor, left the mine and headed for a union meeting in town. Many other miners went to the local grocers or headed to the town saloons. To reprimand the workers, Union Pacific ordered all the local businesses to shut down, and by 2 p.m. all the stores had closed. At this time, a mob of 150 white coal miners stormed into the Chinatown section of Rock Springs, Wyoming, and wreaked havoc. The attackers vandalized shops, set buildings on fire, and committed open murder against the small neighborhood. "28 Chinese men were murdered, with 11 burned alive in their cabins. 15 others were wounded. 79 Chinese homes owned by the rail company were burned to the ground, and approximately $148,000 worth of Chinese-owned property was destroyed." Chinese miners were scalped, mutilated, branded, decapitated, dismembered, and hanged from gutter spouts. One survivor presented their own grisly account of the events to the Chinese consul in New York City. Some of the rioters would let a Chinese go after depriving him of all his gold and silver, while another Chinese would be beaten with the butt ends of the weapons before being let go. Some of the rioters, when they could not stop a Chinese, would shoot him dead on the spot and then search and rob him. Some would overtake a Chinese, throw him down, search and rob him before they would let him go. Some, who took no part either in beating or robbing the Chinese, stood by shouting loudly and laughing and clapping their hands. The survivors were terrified and fled town in every direction in utter confusion at the sudden attack. Some reported having taken cover in small ground openings where they sat in fear until the following day. Some were killed on the outer banks of the town as they fled, others were murdered after being found hiding in their homes, and those who were sick or could not run were burned alive in their houses. Those who fled town and survived only returned when they were escorted back by the National Guard, which then permanently resided at the newly established Camp Pilot Butte just outside of town. The white mob was motivated once again by the perception of Chinese workers infringing on white labor rights and taking jobs that they saw as rightfully belonging to them. The bourgeoisie had finally reaped what they had sown, after years of treacherously planting the idea in the minds of proletarians that the Chinese immigrants were the cause of economic crises. After this myth was fully accepted, white labor was convinced of the necessity of excluding the Chinese and was staunchly in favor of the 1882 Exclusion Act. However, the Chinese Exclusion Act left the bourgeois class dealing with a major contradiction, because while they set the groundwork for Chinese exclusion, they did not necessarily desire the consequences. The bourgeois class was in favor of abundant supplies of low-wage Chinese workers when labor was needed on large projects, but for the meantime, they especially wanted to maintain diplomatic and trade relations with China. This meant permitting entry for Chinese merchants as well as other middle-class migrants. One industrialist who was staunchly opposed to blanket exclusion was Daniel Augustus Tompkins. In 1906, Tompkins testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs, pleading his case for allowing Chinese merchants in and out of the U.S. He argued for the necessity of creating a sharper legal distinction between the lower-class Chinese coolie and the upper-class Chinese merchants and traders. For Tompkins and much of the U.S. bourgeois class, it was important to keep the door open to Chinese merchants because the Angel Treaty essentially allowed China to boycott American imports if America excluded Chinese merchants. The difficulties that emerged from the process of allowing middle-class Chinese in, while excluding Chinese labor, proved in practice much more burdensome than in the imagination of the ruling class. Bourgeois spokesmen like Tompkins seem to have imagined Chinese merchants to carry upper-class or Euro-American dispositions and mannerisms. But when Chinese arrived in the U.S., immigration officials struggled to determine their class position. Unskilled laborers might try to pass themselves off as merchants to gain entry, and it was up to immigration officials to stop this. But how? U.S. officials interrogated and harassed all the migrants coming through, and were even compelled to search hands for calluses, an indication of manual labor. The six companies continued to welcome and facilitate the Chinese newcomers to America, but in the face of ongoing efforts surrounding the demonization of Chinese and government attention towards Chinese hygiene, the six companies took the additional measure of encouraging hygienic discipline among the Chinese. To some extent, they urged new migrants to understand themselves as de facto representatives of all Chinese people. Their behavior affected the way white society perceived not only them, but Chinese people in general, and therefore, the six companies and Chinese diplomats demanded moral behavior from migrants, repatriated the indignant, and aided American police forces in repressing migrant activities perceived to invite white brutality, from gambling, opium usage, and prostitution to secret and revolutionary societies. Most officials in China were against Chinese emigration and were therefore somewhat indifferent to the Exclusion Act. Wu Ting-fang, China's minister to the United States at the turn of the 20th century, even defended exemption policies and had no objection to the restriction of Chinese laborers. If Americans think it is desirable to keep out the objectionable classes of Chinese, by all means let them do so. Even Chinese diplomats within the U.S. didn't necessarily agree with a blanket opposition to the act. One Chinese diplomat agreed with segregation, but not by race. He suggested that rather than arbitrarily excluding Chinese, it would be fairer to exclude the illiterate and degenerate classes of all nations, and recommended that it would be more effective to introduce a literacy test for all immigrants. Although the literacy qualification would remain in the tool chest of the U.S. empire, the 1880s and 90s saw the expansion of different forms of state and federal legislation that continued to limit the immigration of Chinese and repress their social advancement. The Scott Act of 1888 forbade Chinese denizens from re-entering the U.S. after traveling abroad. In 1889, the constitutionality of the Chinese Exclusion Act was affirmed in the court case Che Chan-ping versus the United States. In 1892, the Geary Act added 10 additional years to the Chinese Exclusion Act, and in 1893, Congress granted itself the power to arbitrarily expel Chinese, based on the court ruling in Fong Yu-ting versus the United States. While these exclusion measures continued to push forward, the tides began to rapidly shift for the Chinese all over the world, when in 1894, the Chinese revolutionary Sun Yat-sen led an uprising under the banner Revive China, which sought to reaffirm Chinese identity worldwide. The movement was popular, widespread, and it planted the seeds for the Boxer Rebellion of 1899 to 1901, an anti-colonial, anti-foreign, and anti-Christian uprising that dealt one of the final blows to the Qing dynasty. The message of the revived China movement eventually reached Chinese people in the US, with many of them embracing the new Chinese political philosophy, national independence from foreign domination, democratic rights of the people, and people's welfare and livelihood. These principles resonated with the Chinese immigrants in America, many of whom still held close connections to China through family, culture, language, politics, and its leaders. It also resonated with many Chinese who may have arrived voluntarily in the US, but were nonetheless still being dominated by a foreign country whose land they lived on, but whose society they were not welcome. Persecuted Chinese immigrants had previously launched court battles against the state and federal governments, but it was in this context of China's nationalist revolution that Chinese immigrants in America would begin to truly assert their dignity. In 1898, Wong Kim Ark, a US-born Chinese man, was denied re-entry to the US after traveling abroad. As a legally stateless US denizen, Wong fell between the cracks of the Naturalization Act, and he was forced to launch a court battle that landed in the Supreme Court. After winning this landmark case, the Supreme Court granted Wong with US-born Chinese-American citizenship, and became the first Chinese person to achieve American citizenship in US history. The court case was the most significant achievement won by a Chinese migrant and gave all Chinese people a foot in the door towards eventually becoming full American citizens themselves. The Golden Gate had finally cracked open for the Chinese. The Chinese were always forced to negotiate their survival in a society that either sought to exploit or exclude them. These survival tactics often revolved around clandestine means to avoid attention of authorities, such as sneaking into the country, trading opium, working collectively, and finding whatever imperial openings they could to survive. For example, in 1906, a San Francisco earthquake and fire destroyed an immigration facility holding many documents on Chinese migrants. In response, a large number of Chinese were compelled to invent paper sons, who could claim they were US citizens and that their records had been destroyed. Once these paper sons existed in official documents, Chinese relatives could make their way over, claiming the identity of the paper sons. Through these means, as well as other openings, over 84,000 Chinese immigrants still managed to make their way and settle in the US during the years of the Exclusion Act. Progress for the Chinese living in the US was only temporary. Almost immediately after the Supreme Court's landmark ruling, the US turned its attention toward imperialism. The United States began annexing and purchasing former Spanish colonies, bringing them under its control in 1898 with the onset of the Spanish-American War. Perhaps the most significant territory brought into question through the conflict was the Philippines. Shortly after the Americans landed, Filipino nationalists fought stubbornly against the US invaders, but they were simply unprepared for the genocidal tactics and scorched earth methods that Washington was willing to use against them. For example, on the Philippine island of Luzon alone, one US Army general reported that over 1 million Filipinos were killed, most of them civilians. During this brutal campaign, US officials weren't sure what type of reaction to expect from Asian migrants living in the US. Would they stand up for their Asian neighbors back home, or would they remain loyal to the United States? These questions were particularly acute within the US Navy, whose Pacific sailors included many Asian migrants. Could these Asian sailors be relied on to risk their lives in carrying out the dirty work of an empire that doesn't even grant them citizenship? Anti-Chinese sentiment was already widespread since the 1882 Exclusion Act, but now that the US empire was embarking on imperialist adventures across Central America and the Asian Pacific, xenophobia and racism became part of the military institution itself. The Sailors' Union of the Pacific condemned the Army's employment of Asian sailors on its trans-Pacific transports, sharing the racially infected economic nationalism of other all-white trade unions. the ruling capitalist class, emerging into its imperialist role on the global stage, agreed. After all, the notion of Chinese as traitorous denizens that had infected the minds of the sailors originated in bourgeois media long ago. The exclusion of Chinese and other Asian migrants from the US Navy was implemented alongside the extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act to the newly annexed territories of Hawaii and the Philippines, with strong objections from the Chinese government and people. It wasn't long before Congress made the Chinese Exclusion Act permanent, implementing the law indefinitely from 1904 onward. This was followed by the mass deportation of 250 Chinese who were arrested without even a single warrant. For decades, Chinese migrants had refused to submit to oppressive restrictionist laws and policies, dodging and openly refusing to comply with them. But the new regulations represented an especially painful assault, subjecting even the most influential and Western-educated to harassment and deportation. By 1908, discrimination, persecution, and violence against Chinese had become so unbearable that even the 6 companies, which had always played a facilitator and mediator role between Chinese labor and the government, found the situation intolerable. The frustration and anger of the Chinese community was articulated by an editor of a Chinese newspaper and member of the Big Six, who penned an article titled "The Treatment of the Exempt Classes of Chinese in the United States." In it, he pointed to how the Chinese Exclusion Act promoted anti-Chinese violence, tore families apart, and brought indignation to every class of Chinese migrant, including the Chinese who were supposed to be exempt from these laws. The pamphlet highlights a 1905 State of the Union address by Theodore Roosevelt, who admitted that Chinese people were suffering from a grave injustice. It also points to a statement made in 1907 by the Secretary of Commerce and Labor, who declared that the Exclusion Act was producing discrimination and humiliation among the exempt classes of Chinese immigrants. It also places particular emphasis on how Chinese exclusion violates the Angel Treaty, which was supposed to guarantee free movement of middle and upper-class migrants between the US and China. Overall, the article posed as a collective voice of Chinese people living in the US, but the class interests of the 6 companies were deeply rooted in the concerns that it raised in the article. It made damning condemnations of the laws persecuting them right before proceeding into a discussion on the necessity of excluding unskilled Chinese labor. The exclusion law has been carried out with such vigor that it has almost become an extermination law. The Chinese population in the United States has been reduced from 150,000 in 1880 to 65,000 at present time. During these 25 years, much injustice and wrong have been heaped upon the Chinese people by the United States in its execution of its exclusion policy, and now it is time that this great nation should calmly review the whole question thoroughly and revise the law so that it may fulfill the original intention of Congress, namely, the exclusion of Chinese laborers and the admission of all other classes. Here we see that Chinese exclusion was only taken up as an issue to be challenged by Chinese merchants, diplomats, students, or business owners when it infringed on their own propertied class interests. It became their issue when their stores were looted, their houses robbed, their sons beaten. Therefore, the 6 companies, backed by the petty bourgeois class of Chinese immigrants it represented, urged Congress to frame the act with a clearer distinction between legitimate Chinese immigrants and the illegal coolie. These issues would once again be put on hold with the outbreak of World War I in 1914 and the beginning of US involvement in the war in 1917. When the US started ramping up its military efforts for the war, it recruited thousands of soldiers from Asian communities, including not only Chinese, but Japanese, Filipino, Korean, and Vietnamese. But in doing so, the US government once again faced the same problem as it did earlier in the First Imperialist War with Spain: how to ensure the loyalty of troops to a nation that does not recognize them as citizens. The solution to this problem was found in cracking the Golden Gate open a little more. It was a quid pro quo. If Asian immigrants enlisted to fight for US imperialism, they would be rewarded with US citizenship. Thousands of them agreed, promptly enlisting in the US military, and then, in 1918, qualifying for naturalization rights. Once again, any progress made by Chinese and other Asian migrants was curtailed by regression in other areas. Chinese veterans who were now citizens were still prevented from unifying with their families on US soil, and it was illegal for them to marry so-called light-skinned women. Financial limitations, social norms, and US laws were preventing Chinese women from migrating to the US, which not only helped foster prostitution in Chinatowns, but destroyed the foundational social relations within these families. However, the last obstacle in the way of Chinese migrants becoming full US citizens was finally removed after the US entry into World War II. In 1941, Japan attacked the US military base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and had previously unleashed a terroristic campaign of rape and murder across the Chinese city of Nanking. Japanese imperialism not only threatened to colonize China, but threatened to encroach on US colonies in the Asian Pacific, such as the Philippines or Hawaii. This made China and the US natural allies against Japan and the Axis powers during the war. Therefore, unlike the Japanese migrants in the US, who were systematically incarcerated in concentration camps, the Chinese were looked upon favorably and actively recruited for combat in the war. The Chinese and other eligible Asian migrants understood that participation in the war would give them their key to the Golden Gate of US citizenship, and once again, thousands enlisted to fight for the interests of US imperialism. The Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943 under the Magnuson Act, and the War Brides Act of 1945 later opened immigration to Chinese women. Immigration was still limited until 1952, when the Walter McCarran Immigration and Naturalization Act repealed the 1924 Asian Exclusion Act. And finally, after 100 years of fighting for their survival and fighting for their citizenship rights, Chinese migrants were recognized as full, legal citizens of the US Empire. The US and China may have been natural allies against Japan during World War II, but this alliance came to an abrupt halt in 1949 when Mao Zedong led the Chinese masses through a communist revolution, overthrowing and replacing the Kuomintang nationalists. Shifting into Cold War posture, the US sought to undermine the revolutionary momentum in China by draining the country of its most highly educated and skilled workers. 5,000 Chinese scientists, engineers, and physicists were offered refugee status by the US in the aftermath of the revolution. A similar strategy of opening the door to Chinese refugees was also employed in 1962 during the Great Leap Forward and in 1989 after the Tiananmen Square incident. The Golden Gate, although still inaccessible to many, was now wide open. Chinese were now encouraged to immigrate to the US in large numbers as a means of combating Chinese communism. In 1950, the US population of Chinese was 150,000. In 1990, the Immigration Act allowed for 700,000 Chinese immigrants per year, and according to the 2000 census, at the turn of the millennium, the population of Chinese Americans reached 2.7 million, roughly 1% of the total US population. It is easy for historians to research the anti-Chinese violence and bloodshed in cases like Shasta County in 1858, San Francisco in 1877, or Rock Springs in 1885, and come to the conclusion that white labor was the engine behind Chinese exclusion. White labor did play a vocal role in pushing for Chinese exclusion, and it failed to recognize the true nature of its struggle as a class struggle rather than an ethnic or nationalist one. White labor was granted certain rights by the bourgeois class, particularly the right of citizenship, and all the rights that flowed from it, as a means of invoking a false consciousness among the workers that allowed them to see themselves as part of a class of white citizens rather than the working class. The era of US history defined by Chinese exclusion was produced through the totality of US institutions ranging from citizenship, politics, the law, immigration, media, the economy, workplace, and labor unions. Collectively, these institutions destroyed Chinese families, forced immigrants into segregated Chinatowns, and helped cultivate anti-Chinese discrimination and mob violence against Chinese labor. While it is important to account for the violence perpetrated by white labor, it is crucial to take account of the treachery perpetuated by the bourgeois class. The control that the bourgeois class holds over land, means of production, and the state needs to be the material basis and starting point from which we understand the ideological manifestations of anti-Chinese attitudes in the media, legal system, labor unions, and so on. The bourgeoisie is the class that owned the mines and decided when and who among the workers they would lay off. It was the bourgeois class that owned the railway and were solely in control of encouraging Chinese immigration and employment. It was the bourgeois class who owned the media and controlled the anti-Chinese narratives that flowed from it into the minds of the working class. It was the bourgeois class who occupied Congress and passed early exclusion laws in California and later at the national level. It was the bourgeois class who persecuted, excluded, and then bribed Chinese immigrants to participate in its imperialist wars. And it should come as no surprise that it is the bourgeois class who framed the history of this period as a period where white labor, largely propertyless, often uneducated, and frequently desperate, was the sole motivating factor behind helpless politicians whose signatures were pushed onto the Exclusion Act by the labor vote. History shows that the bourgeoisie do not act politically in favor of the proletariat, and there is no reason to believe that the one time they did act in the interests of the proletariat and against their own class interests was in order to push forward the racist Exclusion Act. Even the Chinese petty bourgeois merchants and diplomats in the US were indifferent to the exclusion law so long as it did not affect their own class interests. It was well understood within the bourgeois class, white and Chinese, that racism was intended to be directed towards labor. Chinese exclusion laws only became a problem for Chinese merchants when racism started to bleed in and affect those within their class. But for the most part, they understood and were obedient to the bourgeois necessity of weaponizing racism as a tool of labor discipline. This is why the six companies never took a strong position against the Chinese Exclusion Act, but instead helped instill American expectations surrounding appearance and behavior into the Chinese immigrants. Throughout US history, labor has always been, and continues to be, deeply susceptible to social chauvinist attitudes. These different struggles occurring throughout the history of American society cannot be understood apart from one another, as they co-constitute the material basis from which laws, the media, religion, culture, and ideology emerge. This is an important lesson to keep in mind in the 21st century, as Western anti-Chinese attitudes continue to grow alongside the growth of prosperity in the People's Republic of China. Unity of the working class remains the most important tactic in fighting for a world that no longer produces racism, xenophobia, and other forms of social chauvinism. Fortunately, the American working class, no matter how backward some aspects might be, has also proven capable of cutting across ethnic differences and uniting under the banner of labor solidarity.